past, churches were always understood to be an asset to the community. But what we find at Pacific Justice Institute is that there are more and more communities harassing churches, making it difficult for churches to do what God's called them to do. Well, in the second half of the show, we're going to talk about such a case in the state of Oregon. But the first half of the show, I want to talk about the recent Supreme Court decision that is so important in terms of the impact on religious freedom, and in particular, an impact on the proper interpretation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. To talk with us about this decision is one of our attorneys. He's actually in our Sacramento office, attorney Matt McReynolds. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brad.
Now, Matt, this decision, give us the background of the facts of this case. What happened and what brought it to the Supreme Court?
Well, sure, Brad. This was a case involving a large cross. It was, depending on how you measure it, 32-foot cross or a 40-foot cross in Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. And like a lot of other crosses of its kind, it was erected just after World War I. And you see these all over the country and in a lot of different places. But these kinds of crosses, Brad, just became identified with the sacrifice of the soldiers and with those who gave their lives in Europe. And so that's what we're talking about with the Bladensburg Cross, sometimes called the Peace Cross or the Memorial Cross in Maryland.
Okay, so this cross was erected a long time ago. It wasn't just put up. And it was there not to be an insult or an affront to people of other faiths. It was there for the purpose of recognizing those who had died, who'd given their lives for freedom in World War I. Right?
Right, and Brad, some of the moms who got together along with other members of their community and originally put this up even said they regarded it as like the gravestone of their son. You know, many who lost their lives in that conflict were buried overseas, and it was difficult at that time for families to go to those cemeteries. And so these local reminders were really important to families to commemorate their loved ones.
Now, it was originally put on private property, correct? And then it was transferred to the government on government property, but originally it was on private property put up by private funds. Now, what happened to create this to be an issue? I mean, it seems like the community didn't mind it. Was there an outside group that came in and filed this lawsuit?
Well, you guessed it, Brad. We're talking about there are a few of these groups out there that we've tangled with over the years. One that's well known is the Freedom from Religion Foundation. This particular one was the American Humanist Association. And we've actually litigated against them out here on the West Coast. But, yeah, they filed a suit against this cross because they insisted that just even a minimal amount of funds spent to maintain this cross that was nearly 100 years old somehow violated the First Amendment.
So they contended that this violated the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause. I assume that they were supportive of a very strict interpretation of the Establishment Clause in the context of the Lemon Test, so that basically with the intent of sterilizing religion, symbols of faith, completely from the public square. What was a past conflict that we've had with this organization? I want the audience to understand where they're coming from and where we've had to deal with them before.
Right. Well, Brad, ours actually dealt with a similar kind of war memorial. It wasn't a large cross. It was just a depiction of a soldier kneeling in front of a cross that was clearly a battlefield cemetery kind of a picture, and actually a very well-known image that probably a lot of our listeners have seen. And so we dealt with that out here on the West Coast in Southern California, a city called Lake Elsinore. And unfortunately, Brad, at the time, that court operating under this nearly 50-year-old structure of what you referred to as the Lemon Test and what we'll get into more in a minute, decided that even that kind of depiction was unconstitutional. And that's why we're excited about this decision the Supreme Court has just come down with, because this is going to rewrite the way that the courts approach these kinds of cases.
Right. Now, the lower courts here, I understand the Federal District Court and the Circuit Court, they held that this cross was unconstitutional, violation of the Establishment Clause. What happened at the Supreme Court, though? What was their decision? And sort of unravel the significance of that decision to our audience.
Sure. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court took up this case, and they've dodged these kinds of issues largely for a while, Brad. They've looked at some of these crosses, even some from the same era, and what they've largely done has been to say, well, if it's transferred to private hands, then that's okay. And sometimes they've had local governments or local communities go through all kinds of hoops in order to maintain the cross's constitutionality. Well, thanks to some of the newest arrivals on the Supreme Court, the changes to the Supreme Court in just the last few years, they decided to take a stand. And once and for all, they said, not only is this cross constitutional, but we're going to just reach out and address all kinds of other long-standing symbols and practices that are part of our American culture. And we want to put an end once and for all to these kinds of challenges by these activist groups.
Now, we at Pacific Justice Institute have argued in the past that the Establishment Clause is not there for the purpose of a government sterilizing symbols or historical expressions of faith and culture from the public square. We've argued that in our briefing. Give us some examples of what we've argued and how the Supreme Court ended up reflecting on some of those examples.
Well, this was very gratifying to read as we went through the opinion, Brad. And we've been pointing out for a number of years, look, all over the United States, we have cities that are named after saints, named after religious themes and religious elements. Out here on the West Coast, it's a lot of San Diego and San Jose and San Francisco, Los Angeles, cities with very religious origins. We're not going to go around and have the names of all of our major cities declared unconstitutional. And Brad, the Supreme Court, Justice Alito, writing for the majority, actually used those very same examples that we've been mentioning in the last several years to say, look, we want to put a stop to this kind of thinking in the courts once and for all, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to say that these kinds of long-standing traditions and symbols, even state mottos for that matter, are presumptively constitutional.
Wow. I mean, that's huge. And it's going to be very empowering, I know, for local governments, state governments, so that when groups like the Freedom from Religion Foundation or this group, the American Humanist Association, threatens to sue them or files lawsuit, I think it's really going to save a lot of tax dollars, too, because it's going to make things very clear to the lower courts. Let's say there's a street named Angel Way. They're not going to have to suddenly skirmish to change the name of the street sign. They can say, hey, we're protected. The Supreme Court has finally resolved. We don't have to kowtow to all of these threats or waste taxpayer dollars on unnecessary litigation. I think this is going to be a major step forward for a lot of local governments, state governments, as well as giving real clear direction to our federal courts. Now, I understand, Matt, that in fact this was not a 5-4 decision. This was actually a 7-2 decision. What compelled Justice Kagan and Breyer to join this perspective with regards to the interpretation of the Establishment Clause not to declare this unconstitutional?
Well, this is really interesting, Brad, because oftentimes people think about the court just in terms of liberals and conservatives. And the reality is, there's really a spectrum there. And you've got some justices that are more conservative than others, and some that are more liberal than others. And Justice Breyer, Justice Kagan, rather, not even they could quite stomach the rationales of the far left. One of the things, Brad, that the Humanist Association actually suggested should be done in order to make this cross constitutional was to lop off the two arms of it and basically make it like a pole. And the court saw that for what it was. That would be deeply offensive to people of faith, to just cut off the arms of the cross. We don't want to do that as a society. We just don't want to go there. And so even Justices Kagan and Breyer on some of these kinds of cases have been able to be polled and make these not just 5-4 decisions, but as you mentioned, 7-2 decisions, which just make them all the stronger.
Well, and also I understand that the court said that, if they were to remove street signs and crosses like this, war memorials, just because of the fact that some see it in a religious context or used to see it in a religious context, that would actually violate the Establishment Clause by being state hostility to religion. And I thought that was very inspiring as well.
Well, that's a great point, Brad, because that's something that the court has underemphasized in the past, the notion of hostility toward religion. And that was really brought out well in this opinion and has just reinvigorated those types of potential challenges as well.
Excellent. Well, Matt, keep up the great work. And I know that there's many people out in the country right now who are very, very encouraged by this, as they should be. This is a major breakthrough with regards to a proper interpretation of the Establishment Clause and pushing back in a major way those trying to sterilize faith and symbols of faith and mentioning of religion out of the public square. So I'm very pleased with this. Keep up the great work.
Thanks, Brad.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. My name is Boots Hawks. The first day in the military, they march you to the barber shop, and I had sort of long hair. I was one of those California long-haired hippie boys, and I got all that chopped off. It turned me into a different person. It changed me from the wild, crazy person that I was at the time to a person that really cared about our country and thought about our country first. What it means to me to be an American is living in a country that is free, living in a country that our founding fathers declared that our freedom was established from God-given rights, not from man-given rights. About a year and a half ago, in fact, it was right around the 4th of July, I was looking at my emails and I decided to put God Bless America on there. On the 6th of November, my boss called me in and said that she had a complaint about that being on the email and told me I had to take it off. I said, well, okay, well, if it's offending somebody, I'll take it off. After I told her that I'd taken it off, I said, I was just going to seek legal counsel to see if, my rights were being violated about it.
It's sad to see so much paranoia against religion that you even see patriotic expressions like God Bless America under attack.
Well, the next day I was called down to the nursing supervisor's office, and at that time, during the discussion, she said I was going to be put on administrative leave immediately. I was going to call Pacific Justice, but I looked on their website and there was a little box in there that I filled in, and within an hour they got back to me and the ball started rolling to save my job and try to get my rights back.
We at the Pacific Justice Institute were very shocked to hear Mr. Hawks' story about how the hospital treated him, a veteran who fought and defended our freedoms and our rights and our liberties, only to find out that in the United States he was having his trampled upon.
My initial response was, why would anybody complain about that? I was really, kind of puzzled. It wasn't wishing anybody harm. It was only wishing good for our country.
No one in America should ever have to worry about being punished at work simply because of a patriotic expression like God Bless America. We at the Pacific Justice Institute are committed to Mr. Hawks, just like everyone else we represent, to defend him without charge, and we're committed to defend him until we have final justice in this matter. And folks, if you'd like to support the Pacific Justice Institute and what we're doing without charge to help so many people across the country, just go to our website, pji.org. That's P for Pacific, J for Justice, I for Institute.org. And there you can choose to support the Pacific Justice on either a one-time or a monthly basis. You can also sign up to get our Legal Insider newsletter. It's a weekly update on our cases, and it gives you something to specifically pray for as we go into these battles to defend religious freedom, parental rights, and other important civil liberties. And also, we have a great resource there you want to take advantage of. It's opt-out forms for sex education that most parents would find highly objectionable. This is spreading across the country, folks, and we provided this legal, customized opt-out form that it will be helpful to people in all 50 states. Just go to our website, pji.org, P for Pacific, J for Justice, I for Institute.org. Now, we have with us on the line Ray Hacke to talk about this very important case taking place there in the state of Oregon involving a church whose rights are being stepped on and challenged by the local community. Ray, thank you for joining us. Tell us about Coles Valley Church. What's going on with this church?
Well, Coles Valley Church, which I'll call CVC for short, is a small church of about 20 congregants, give or take a few. It's located in Umpqua, a rural farming community in Douglas County, which is in southern Oregon. Its church building sits on 1.44 acres, and it actually predates Oregon's statehood. Oregon became a state in 1859, and the building was built in 1854. The building still looks like it came straight out of Little House on the Prairie.
Okay, so it's a little church there. It doesn't sound like it's a big threat to anyone, and yet I understand that they want a parsonage there on their facility, on their grounds, where the pastor can stay. That sounds pretty normal as well. So, tell me about that.
Okay. Well, first I have to tell you about Pastor Matt Royston. He's he grew up around agriculture. He spent a lot of his life around it, and he still works in it when he's not serving as CVC's pastor. He's got a real heart for people in rural farming communities like Umpqua, and that's why he feels called to live and work among them. Up until last year, Pastor Matt lived in Roseburg, which is about 20 minutes away from Umpqua, a short drive down I-5. However, he's long had a conviction that he needs to live and work among the people he serves out in Umpqua. He wants to be readily accessible to any member of the community who may need prayer, counseling, encouragement, companionship, even help with household projects or chores. He wants to go through what they go through so he can empathize with whatever struggles they're facing, whether it's a drought, a flood, whatever else.
Okay.
The problem is that Umpqua doesn't have a whole lot of available housing. He could live in Sutherland, which is closer to Umpqua than it is to Roseburg, but even then, he'd be in an urban setting and living away from the people he's called to serve, and in a very different environment to boot. So he came up with the idea of converting one room, just one room, in the building on the church's property into a parsonage for himself and his wife. He even sold his house in Roseburg so he could move there. He and his wife are currently living in a motorhome until this gets finalized and they know they can proceed.
Okay, so sounds pretty benign to me. I mean, a pastor should be able to serve his congregants, the community. That's what he needs to do. I understand that this church, that they actually got permission, but they had to get permission not once, but twice. Why did they have to get permission twice?
So the first time the Douglas County Planning Department issued a permit, CBC's neighbors appealed the decision to Oregon's Land Use Board of Appeals, or LUBA. They contended that the county should have provided notice and held a hearing on the matter, and LUBA held that they were right. So LUBA kicked the decision back to the Douglas County Planning Commission, which this time followed proper procedure and held a hearing on February 21st earlier this year in Roseburg. At that hearing, Pastor Matt showed up, as did I, to present testimony in favor of the parsonage. The neighbors showed up to oppose it. In the end, the Planning Commission voted to approve the parsonage by a 3-1 vote. The neighbors vowed to appeal it, and they have.
Now, Ray, I understand that when you say neighbors, we're really just talking about one couple, one man and woman in that community who are neighbors who don't like it. Why was this couple so obstinate about trying to keep out this pastor and his wife from being able to serve that community by living in one of the little room there on this little church grounds? What was their problem with this? Why were they so opposed to it?
Well, CVC's property is located in an area zoned for exclusive farm use. Most of the properties in that area, as you might imagine, are farms, including these particular neighbors. They operate a vineyard where they grow grapes to give to wineries. But state and local law does allow for churches and single-family dwellings to be located in areas zoned for exclusive farm use. CVC's proposed parsonage combines the two. Pastor Matt hopes to remodel one room in the current building to serve in a parsonage for himself and his wife. The argument that the neighbors made to the Douglas County Planning Commission is that they don't feel comfortable engaging in everyday farming activities with Pastor Matt and his wife around. They worry that Pastor Matt and his wife would complain about them spraying pesticides on their crops and that sort of thing. However, the Planning Commission addressed that by conditioning its approval of the proposed parsonage on CVC filing and recording what's called a resource management covenant. It's a document that essentially says the occupants of CVC's property cannot complain about its neighbors engaging in normal farming activities.
All right, so the bottom line is the Planning Commission went ahead, they heard these concerns, they were very accommodative, but they still nonetheless ruled in favor of this church being able to have the pastor and his wife living in the church as a parsonage to serve the community. It seems that this is very reasonable, and yet this couple is appealing this decision. Can they do that? Do they have standing to appeal this decision?
I would say they don't. Under Oregon law, a county's land use decision has to impinge on a party's personal or property interests for the party to have standing to appeal. Merely being unhappy with the decision won't cut it.
Right. I mean, it's not
approval.
It's not their property. They're not being impacted by the property. They're not hindered in any way on how they use their property, this couple. So I don't see it as a valid appeal. What are we doing at Pacific Justice Institute to combat this?
Well, we filed the motion to intervene, and we're intervening on the side of the county on behalf of Coles Valley Church. There's a federal law called the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which prohibits county governments from substantially burdening the free exercise of religion unless there's a compelling interest in doing so. By approving CBC's request to establish a parsonage on its property, not once but twice, Douglas County has essentially admitted that there is no compelling interest in not allowing such a parsonage. Given that Coles Valley Church only has roughly 20 members or so, it doesn't have a huge budget. So it probably couldn't afford a lawyer if Pacific Justice Institute weren't around to help. It likely would have had to abandon its hopes of establishing a parsonage and Pastor Royston fulfilling his calling to live and work among the people of Umpqua. That's why the work that PJI does is so important. We help churches in CVC's position free of charge, and we hope more churches in Oregon take advantage of our services.
Right. And Ray, I really appreciate the work you're doing. And I want people out there listening to this to understand that while we have an office there in Oregon serving the people in Oregon, we have affiliate attorneys all across the United States. So if you're in a similar situation, you should not hesitate to contact the Pacific Justice Institute. I want people also to understand that this is a very, very significant matter because if we're not successful and if the opposition is somehow successful in ordering this church not to let a pastor and his wife be there and a parsonage there on the property, this could inspire other cities across the United States to do the same thing, to try to boot off clergy from living and residing there in the community on their church property. There's places across the country where pastors and their wives couldn't afford to live in that community or find a place to live in that community like this in this situation. And they would basically it'd be very difficult for them to carry out their ministry, to be able to serve that community, to serve their members of their church or those in that community and the needs of that community. So this is a very important case. If you're in a similar situation where you find that your church is being harassed and prevented from using its facility as God's called them to use it, or specifically being prevented or harassed from being able to have your pastor or your clergy be able to live there on the premises to serve that community, please do not hesitate to contact us at the Pacific Justice Institute. We're here to serve you without charge. That's what we're all about. Ray, once again, thank you for the fine work that you're doing, and please give our best to that wonderful church. And I know many people will be praying for that church in the days ahead. So folks, there you have it. It's our God-given freedoms we're talking about. Now, let's choose to keep them. I'm Brad Dacus, president of the Pacific Justice Institute. Have a great weekend.